Good afternoon, dear listeners. This is the Foreign Policy Podcast published by the MGIMO Institute for International Studies. My name is Sofia Babkina. I'm a research fellow at MGIMO University and the editor-in-chief of this podcast. My guest today is Dmitry Stefanovich, a research fellow at the Institute of World Economy and International Relations of the Russian Academy of Sciences and author of the Stratdela Substack. Dima, great pleasure to have you here.
Hello, Sofia, and hello, dear listeners.
We already have a tradition of getting together at the beginning of the year to discuss strategic issues. Considering today's conversation, this is your third and actually fourth time as our guest. We had to come up with something new each time, so we decided to record two podcasts, one in Russian and one in English. I apologize in advance to our Russian-speaking listeners as some of the questions will overlap with the Russian language episode, and also to our English-speaking listeners who have grown in numbers in recent months, because this is the only second English language episode right after the interview with the IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi.
That's an honor.
Okay. For you and for him.
Well, I'll try, even if the questions will be the same, I'll try to give different answers.
Okay. Let's begin with some introductory remarks. This discussion approaches nuclear risks through doctrine, signaling, and precedent rather than treaty mechanics. By 2026, the nuclear risks management increasingly depends on how states interpret each other's behavior in real conflicts, how doctrines are applied in practice, and how precedents affect legitimacy and restraint. The key issue is not the restoration of past agreement or itself, but whether escalation can still be bounded under current conditions. Classical deterrence theory assumed relatively stable doctrines and clear thresholds. Recent conflicts, however, suggest a widening gap between declaratory policy and operational behavior, as we've seen. How large is the gap today between nuclear deterrence theory and how deterrence is actually practiced?
Actually, I don't think that this gap didn't exist previously, because as some of my senior colleagues often say, nuclear doctrine is not Holy Bible. It's not like in the case of crisis, this or that commander-in-chief will look in his doctrine and to find out what should be his next moves. So this gap was there for some time. The problem is that now we have actions or inactions that are not really aligned with what is written in doctrinal documents, in strategic planning documents, almost immediately after they are published. This is the challenge. And at the same time, there is appetite of some actors, sometimes of actors whose main goal is disruption, to challenge the doctrines, to find whether these red lines are actually red lines, how wide are those red lines, and so on. So I think the problem is not in these differences between operational policy and the declaratory policy, but in the fact that now we have so many ongoing crises globally and many actors who intentionally try to widen this gap. And I think part of the problem is also that the whole global situation is anything but stable. Like, we don't have the Cold War stability, we don't have the unipolar moment stability. We have achieved multipolarity, but no one promised that it will be safer and more secure to anyone. Because it's clear that when you have many actors, no matter how malign or benign those are, you have much more dimensions for any crisis. And when there's a crisis between the two, the third party might play any role they would like.
Let's talk about great nuclear powers. I mean, Russia, the United States, and China. All the three countries formally emphasize deterrence, but differ in escalation concepts, thresholds, and signaling styles. Let's elaborate on them. What do you think are the main differences you would highlight?
Well, first, I think that China would disagree that they are a nuclear great power, a nuclear superpower. They often like to say that no, they're different. And actually, frankly speaking, judging solely by nuclear arsenal, they have perfect grounds to go this way. That's why I'm so surprised that no US official ever tried to demand them to discuss strategic arsenal instead of nuclear arsenal. But this is a whole other topic. I think the problem is that the understanding of how deterrence works is a bit different in all countries, and judging from that, the way they perceive their declaratory policy is also different. For the Americans, it's clear that they believe in extended deterrence, they believe in first strike, including in case of non-nuclear attacks, and they believe that they can restore deterrence through nuclear use. In Russia, we have specifically written in what is not a holy Bible, but still a very important document, in the basic principles of state policy and nuclear deterrence, that nuclear deterrence works at all times until nuclear use. So after nuclear use, we enter some uncharted waters. We don't know what happens there, and no official ever said that through nuclear use you can re-establish nuclear deterrence. In China, well, they still think that no first use is the best option at least for P5 to prosper in nuclear domain. There are questions whether their current force posture is fully aligned with nuclear no first use, but they continue to say that this is the ultimate solution to all the problems we have in nuclear domain. I once heard the idea that it doesn't matter whether you have a transparent doctrine or non-transparent doctrine. What matters is whether you have a good doctrine or a bad doctrine. And non-first use is a good doctrine, so it doesn't matter how transparent you are. Actually, we have one practical, empirical evidence that non-first use can be quite good. It is that we have a bilateral non-first use between Russia and China since 90s. And while many people forget this, but I strongly believe that arms control in such a form, because apart from this mutual non-first use, we have limitations on military activity throughout the border and so on. So arms control was essentially one of the bricks in the foundation of the current state of Russian-Chinese relations. So probably, if everyone will believe in non-first use and declare it, it might become more stable. But what it definitely not aligned with is with the idea of extended deterrence. So for the US, it is much harder to go through with that. Actually, one example that I would also like to raise is that we have very old agreement on prevention of nuclear war between Moscow and Washington. It's rather basic, but as far as I know, originally it was meant to become something much more detailed and working to actually prevent nuclear wars, but the US allies freaked out because if there will be a mechanism to prevent nuclear war between Moscow and Washington, who will protect them from the Soviet hordes? Well, we are where we are, and this leads to another thought that it hasn't been actually, but now it's even more critical, that doctrines and postures in Russia, in China, in the US are no longer only about the nuclear superpowers or nuclear great powers. Other players, allies, partners, adversaries, neutrals, they have a much bigger vote now than they used to have.
International attention has been focused on Iran's nuclear program. In the summer of last year, a significant precedent was set when military strikes were carried out against nuclear facilities under IAEA safeguards in an NPT non-nuclear weapon state by a nuclear weapon state, the United States, and a de facto nuclear state of Israel. Moreover, the Iran-US negotiating process in the winter of 2026 was interrupted by the outbreak of Israeli strikes against Iran conducted with US support. How does this precedent affect the logic of restraint embedded in the non-proliferation regime? And second question, if I may, does the current pattern of coercion and precedent setting increase the long-term risk of expanding the nuclear armed club?
Basically, yes and yes. The strikes by a nuclear weapon state against safeguarded nuclear facilities of a non-nuclear weapon state is a major blow to the whole NPT regime and specifically to IAEA. On the one hand, IAEA still does a great job globally and also trying to mediate good faith negotiations between selected parties, not only in the Middle East but elsewhere. But still, their credibility and legitimacy has been heavily undermined by this, because actually there are plenty of people who can argue that IAEA worked as independent strike assessment body both last year and maybe this year as well. At the same time, Whether it will lead to more nuclear aspirations in non-nuclear weapon states, it remains to be seen, because while, of course, we see an example of North Korea, who is kind of untouchable because of their nuclear arsenal, at least it's perceived as such, but at the same time we see that for threshold countries, or for countries who try to achieve nuclear capability, they are entering very dangerous waters, because major powers will not stand still and watch establishment of new nuclear weapon states. They can carry out kinetic action to prevent such things. And as we see now, it's not only Israel who can be engaged in such actions.
Let's talk about technological evolution. So hypersonic systems, they blur distinctions between strategic and non-strategic missions and between nuclear and conventional roles. How do hypersonic weapons complicate doctrinal assumptions about warning attribution and escalation control?
I think that actually this started not only with hypersonic weapons, but originally, for example, with low observable land attack cruise missiles, which also can be dual capable and can be quite stealthy and provide little warning. With hypersonic weapons, again, it compresses decision-making time, especially if we are talking about intermediate range capabilities, because for intercontinental ranges, traditional ballistic missiles are faster than hypersonic ones. But the problem is that with hypersonic weapons, again, especially at longer ranges, it is often quite hard to define the trajectory and what is the intended target. And this leads to ambiguity. You might not be sure what is your adversary is trying to hit. Probably we will see something of that kind during the current crisis in the Middle East, with Iranians using all they have at their disposal to strike selected targets. And probably sometimes the weapons are not perform as intended, which is also quite normal. Like, there are no perfect weapon systems, and if you use dozens or hundreds of those, it is quite normal that some will misperform, will underperform, and so on. But nevertheless, it leads to some problems. Also, a lot happens not on the battlefield itself, but in the minds of decision makers. And for example, with hypersonic weapons, it is clear that they are perceived by most countries both as an opportunity, but also as a threat. Because originally, when there was a lot of hypersonic projects in the US in the 90s, in the 2000s, they were perceived as a part of this prompt global strike capability, and it was perceived as a challenge, as a tool for decapitating or disarming strikes. Now, of course, our hypersonic weapons are good ones. We have them to ensure second strike, to ensure penetration of US ballistic missile defense. But again, the concerns about possible decapitation or disarming capability by using hypersonic weapons is there. And coming back to my original comment that you cannot be sure what is the intended target when true hypersonic weapon is being launched your way, this might lead to misperceptions, to overreactions, and so on.
Let's proceed with the non-strategic nuclear weapons. They are increasingly discussed in the context of limited war. What makes non-strategic nuclear weapons particularly hard to integrate into stable deterrence relationships?
I think the challenge, there are a number of challenges here. One of them is that non-strategic nuclear weapons do not exist in a vacuum. They're like, you don't have such an arsenal just for the sake of having it. In the Russian case, the general perception is that you need these weapons to hedge against possible conventional disbalances vis-a-vis selected adversaries. And the problem that we, unlike our American friends, we are living on a continent that where you might have quite a lot of adversaries. And again, a lot of these adversaries have significant conventional arsenals, not to mention nuclear ones. Then, in the US case, non-strategic nuclear weapons play a role of something more political signaling, but again, if mated to modern delivery systems, they also can be quite capable, and given their forward deployment modes, they are essentially strategic if you look at them from the Russian perspective or from the Chinese perspective for that matter, especially when nuclear-tipped SLICAM will enter service. The challenge is that you cannot detach non-strategic nuclear weapons in a separate topic. You need to discuss them in a broader context, and then if you start this discussion, you need to look on the one hand on strategic weapons, on the other hand you need to look at conventional capabilities and force postures, and on missile defenses, air defenses, whatever. So the problem is that they do complicate things, but under current circumstances it's really hard to find an easy solution. Actually, one relatively simple idea that has been proposed several years ago was that just for anyone who has a non-strategic nuclear arsenal to mimic the Russian approach and try to store them at central level storages, not co-deploy them with delivery systems. That can be a very stabilizing factor, but unfortunately it didn't gain any traction back in the day. I hope we might get there eventually, because again, given that we see conventional weapons, strategic conventional weapons and so on, there can achieve some goals, then probably the value of non-strategic nuclear weapons eventually can become lower. But it remains to be seen how the things will develop in the next years and decades.
Space. The planning or assessment of nuclear operations today depend heavily on space-based assets that were peripheral during much of the Cold War. How does reliance on space systems alter escalation pathways compared to early nuclear eras?
Well, I wouldn't say that space didn't play that a big role back in the Cold War era, but it was more on the strategic level than on the operational level. Because, of course, we had early warning satellites, we have reconnaissance satellites, and communications. Actually, space communications is something that was extremely important for the strategic forces back in the day. But now, due to a lot of technological developments, we see that they are being continuously used on a tactical level, on operational level. And so the things that originally were intended for strategic level only now have implications and see actual uses during regional conflicts and so on. And this naturally leads to the demand to have counter-space capabilities, to try to degrade your adversary's assets, and so on. Again, it works both ways or three ways, because, for example, now Americans are very much concerned with growing Chinese capabilities in this regard, and the US Space Force is actively pursuing counter-space capabilities as well, as Russia and China used to pursue when there was a bigger gap between the US capabilities and capabilities of everyone else. We don't have an easy answer here, and things are they're already getting even more complicated because of a lot of commercial actors providing what is essentially military services, military communication services, military ISR, and so on. We might see a situation where we might come up with some mechanism to prevent at least weaponization of space, but at the same time it is equally possible that we will soon see not some experiments in space, but the deployment of spacecraft with big shiny letters calling them a weapon.
The 2026 NPT RevCon will take place under conditions fundamentally different from those of previous cycles. Arms control agreements among nuclear weapon states have eroded. The disarmament pillar under Article 6 is widely seen as stalled, and recent precedents such as military strikes on IAEA safeguarded nuclear facilities and the interruption of negotiations through the use of force have raised questions about the credibility of restraint within the regime, as we've already discussed. At the same time, the NPT remains the only universal legal framework governing nuclear risks, and expectations among non-nuclear weapon states are increasingly shaped by perceptions of double standards and declining security assurances. In this context, what concrete outcome or set of outcomes at the 2026 NPT RevCon would meaningfully contribute to preserving the credibility of the non-proliferation regime, even if progress on disarmament and arms control remains limited?
Well, I think saving the NPT would be good enough. I mean, without any countries leaving it, despite the very clear consequences of not having a nuclear deterrent that we see these days. But at the same time, I think what might be ultimately even worse is if the major nuclear powers will get rid of a nuclear testing moratorium, because it will dramatically undermine the assurances that were given by nuclear weapon states back in the day. What else can happen? I mean, there will definitely be some issues between NPT supporters and TPNW supporters. This is probably somewhere where P5 or N5 might have a joint statement. I hope they will have joint statements on something more useful than just bashing the TPNW, which actually makes not much sense these days. And especially given the fact that several treaty allies of the Russian Federation are members of TPNW. The prospects are kind of grim, but still some things can be achieved. If by some magic level of political will, Nuclear 5 will be ready to state that they're engaged in some sort of negotiations on arms limitations, or at least on formal risk reduction, this would be a major success.
Short question, short answer, Q&A. What technology has altered escalation dynamics more than expected, to your mind?
Well, I wouldn't say technologies altered this escalation dynamics. The perception of technologies did. So perceptions and misperceptions. And it happened with hypersonic weapons, with artificial intelligence, with outer space capabilities. There can't be too much international discussions. There can't be too much transparency in this regard. And I hope that eventually there will be much more clear and sane understanding of selected technologies, especially by decision makers and by the military officials. So far, I see that there are some challenges in that regard.
Okay, I think I know the answer to that question, unfortunately, but still, which region today combines the most dangerous mix of factors?
Well, actually, it's really hard to define a specific region. I mean, in some regions, situation is less problematic from the perspective of nuclear weapons or from the perspective of strategic escalation, but still there are a lot of challenges there, like if we speak about Latin America or Africa. But if we look at Europe, at the Middle East, or in Northeast Asia, I mean, yes, their mixes are much more impressive. But the problem is that the conflict in any of these regions might escalate to a global scale relatively swiftly.
To your mind, what stabilizing factor receives too little attention?
I think some simple, well, not always simple, but relatively easy tools are underemployed, like notifications, like incidents at sea prevention mechanism, and so on. Of course, all of these can be used to destabilize or to demonstrate that you are unhappy with this or that actions by your adversaries or partners, but like these mechanisms, they deserve much greater attention.
Which Cold War lesson no longer applies in the sphere of strategic stability?
This is a tricky question, but I think it's not a lesson exactly, but somewhat.
Observation?
Observation, yes. During the Cold War, Moscow and Washington actually could achieve something between the two, and they were interested in preserving some sort of stable relations on the global scale. Of course, we engaged in proxy wars, we engaged in some conflicts on our peripheries and so on, but still there was some level of mutual interest in stable relations. I believe that as of 2026, there is much less appetite for stable relations, especially if we are talking about a multipolar world where we have a bigger number of centers that can actually destabilize relations between anyone.
3 events or technologies to watch in 2026.
A space-based intercept of a ballistic missile, AI-assisted nuclear targeting, which probably happens already, but we might see greater transparency there, and formal deployment and maybe even use of air-breathing hypersonic cruise missiles.
Dima, thanks a lot for that discussion. It was a great pleasure, as always, to talk to you. Follow us on social media, and we will see what's happening in the near future in the sphere of strategic stability. Yeah.
Thank you. The pleasure was mine.